Thanks to everybody for coming out to the Virginia Club today. I've got the pleasure of introducing Ray Mattis as our speaker for our April Speakers Luncheon. Ray is a member of the Virginia Club, so it's always good to have a fellow member come out and speak. He's also president and CEO of Retail Alliance. If you ever drive down Granby Street, their building is right on the corner with Virginia Beach Boulevard, over in the Arts District, or Neon District, excuse me. You might see around town the little stickers for the LOVA campaign, the Buy Local campaign. Retail Alliance is behind that. They also have a staff of lobbyists that are part of a statewide network where they lobby on behalf of local retailers and businesses up at the General Assembly each year. And they are also the representative for Equifax in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And I've known Ray for a while. My wife, Kate, has the pleasure of working with Ray at Retail Alliance. Ray is going to talk to us today about how local retailers have weathered the COVID storm and what they've done to help them out during the pandemic. So Ray, without further ado, come on up.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here, especially among friends. It's always nice to have some conversations with fellow members of the Virginia Club. First of all, I'd really like to, as John mentioned, go over a review with you about Retail Alliance. We were formed in 1903, and many of you may know us as the Retail Merchants Association. We used to be headquartered downtown in the Lonsdale building on Granby Street. We used to oversee the parades, the advertising, making sure that the roads were swept and cleaned so dust wouldn't get into local stores, making sure that the shipping lanes were clear coming from the harbor to resupply retailers. And then in the 70s, we moved, as did a lot of companies, out of downtown Norfolk, and we moved into our building on Popular Hall Drive right beside the DMV. Back in 1906, we started the Bureau of Credits, and in order for retailers to be competitive, they needed to extend credit. Prior to that time, commerce was basically based on cash on the barrel. So retailers, to be competitive, they started opening up back room credit offices, and they would approve credit and extend credit, household accounts, and of course they needed a clearinghouse on how people would repay back those debts. And that's really how we got into the credit bureau business. We affiliated ourselves with Equifax in 1976. Again, we were the local credit bureau. And then in 2001, we sold the credit bureau to Equifax. And a lot of the reason with that is technology and actually commerce, because with Visa, MasterCard cards coming out, the need for retailers to have backroom credit offices was a moot point. So we had to reorganize like a lot of organizations. Today we have actually 4 separate business units underneath the Retail Alliance umbrella. We have a foundation, which is a 501c3. It really houses our education. We have what we call the Center for Retail Operations. It takes students through the 7 behaviors necessary to operate a successful retail business. It's mostly geared to aspiring as well as existing members or retailers. We apply for grants. We take a percentage of our membership dues to help underwrite the school. We also, as John mentioned, we operate and own the Virginia Retail Federation. It's the only statewide retail association in the state of Virginia. His wife, Kate Baker, is one of our chief lobbyists, along with Jody Roth. They live basically in the General Assembly up in Richmond, so thank you for that, John. They are lobbying on behalf of retailers statewide. We also, of course, have our for-profit company, which is called Business Solutions, Inc. That they represent Equifax in the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States. Because of our relationships with credit unions and banks and auto and indirect lenders and such, it's very viable for Equifax to have a partner that can still maintain those relationships with about approximately 4,000 customers, $14 million worth of revenue on an annual basis. And then, of course, the association itself is a 501c6 trade association, and we basically afford our members products and services that help them become successful, as well as education and, of course, the advocacy needs. So what we're going to talk about today, of course, is how retailers have gone through this pandemic. And as you can imagine, in the last year, it's been very, very challenging. One thing to note is that bankruptcies have increased greatly. It's up 62% in the last 10 years, most of them being in the reorganization phase of Chapter 11s. And then we're starting to see a lot of movement from Chapter 11s into Chapter 7s, which basically is they're going to cease to exist because of the pandemic. And of course, the restaurant industries have been hit the worst. So we just really completed a retail pulse survey. So I'm going to muddle through a lot of this stuff with you, but it really indicates what's happening on a local basis to the retail industry. And on this particular slide, there's a positive note here, and this is really based on the U.S. Census, is that retail sales in the U.S. jumped 9.8% month over month during March of 2021, following a downward trend that was a 2.7% deficit in the previous month. So this was actually easily beating the forecast from the NRF, or the National Retail Federation, of looking at about a 5.9% gain. A lot of this growth could be attributed to the stimulus checks. This is the biggest increase since May of 2020, as more businesses are beginning to reopen. The $1,400 stimulus checks were sent out in March. We're going to see whether they go. If they're going to go into savings, if they're going to go into sales, if they're going to go into paying off debt. That's something we don't know. Something else that's helped us is, of course, the weather. We had a very brutal cold winter, and now in March, I think we've had a very mild seasonal spring, and we're starting to see people back out in the community. Interesting, there was a double-digit increase in the sporting good industry at 23.5%, in clothing 18.3%. Auto was very big in RVs at 15.1%, food services 13.4%, building materials at 12.1%, gas stations at 10.9%, electronic and appliances, as you can imagine, as people were working remotely, at 10.5%. Furniture, with all those home renovations, was up 5.9%. Health, personal and care was up 5.7%, and beverages was about 1%. And a lot of this can be attributed to the way that the consumers pivoted during the pandemic. This particular slide really illustrates what's happening as we come out of the pandemic. Retail signs are showing a slight increase in Hampton Roads. There's some growth there. This is a good indicator of what the consumption level is in the region. When averaged over 3 months, January was once again represents the largest total retail sales recorded. Continued confirmation of structural changes to expenditure patterns and adjusted in January 2021 and posted, and this is pretty good, 13% increase from January of 2020. And that's, of course, prior to the pandemic. As another round of these stimulus checks are distributed to eligible Americans in March, we're going to see, I think, an increase. We're going to see not an elimination, but we're going to see that the COVID-19 fears are going to subside. We're also going to see some more movement by consumers due to the vaccinations. And we're going to see, we think, a retail sales short-term growth, possibly before a long-term stagnation when we get into the second and third quarter. And of course, again, as I talked about earlier, the big question is, how are consumers going to use their stimulus checks? Are they going to go out and spend? in retail stores? Are they going to pay off debt? Or is it going to go into a savings account? So that remains to be seen. So when we look at the road to recovery, it could be pretty long for many small businesses. In this particular graph, you'll see that with our survey conducted in November, small businesses around the region highlights the negative impact that this pandemic has had on. They were hit hard, as you can see in the blue chart, with over 3/4 feeling a negative impact due to the pandemic. The orange chart shows that 21% have had to close their business, many of which were restaurants, and at some point due to the COVID exposure, either from employees or from customers. And of course, the red chart shows that 78% of those had to close at least 15 days during 2020 as a result of the pandemic. And the biggest thing about the COVID exposure really impacts employees. A lot of employees went home due to unemployment, or they had to be furloughed, or they actually in some cases were laid off. If you look at this particular graph, it shows the current sales versus, well, it's the wrong one. It shows the current sales versus the pre-COVID sales. And basically this is looking at percentages of where businesses were prior to COVID as opposed to where they are after COVID actually hit, and how far they rebounded back. This particular chart shows the current sales again versus the pre-COVID sales in a different type of setting. It's broken out into industries. There's 3 industries illustrated on this chart. There's retail, there's services, and there's restaurants. So 29% of retailers returned to levels that they had experienced prior to COVID. Unfortunately, another group of retailers reported sales of between 26 to 50% of what they had been earning prior to COVID. And that is shown in the green on the top line of the chart, which is showing you 23%. Retail sales have showed signs of recovery, with 33% reporting levels the same or better than the pre-COVID levels. Again, this is a significant percentage whose sales had suffered during the pandemic. 27% of retail services have had levels that were only 51 to 75% of pre-COVID levels. And of course, restaurants, as we all know, felt the biggest impact of the pandemic, with 21% dropping to less than 25% of their pre-COVID sales. Another 32% experienced 26 to 50% of pre-COVID levels, and another 25%, only 51% to 75% of pre-COVID sales. So I think really the story here is that when you're looking into the food and beverage sectors, as well as hospitality, but most importantly the restaurants, a lot of these guys had to be very creative on how they were going to conduct their business. And with the limited seating and being able to have the space to do outdoor seating without seating at the bars, with the limited times of operation, a lot of these restaurant guys, they were suffering. And I think today they're really more into keeping their employees employed as opposed to being a profitable business or taking money home with them. So in other words, 7% of your restaurants experience 100% of pro-COVID, or 93% of all those restaurants had literally no growth during the entire pandemic. When we look at this chart, it basically illustrates the light at the end of the tunnel. There's confidence growing in the business community, in the retail community. They believe that it will improve over the next 6 months. Our current survey shows that the majority of responses were positive, with just under half very confident or extremely confident that their business will improve over the next 6 months. As far as the financial assistance, this graph really goes into detail on those businesses that applied or used the PPP loans or the EIDL loans, the EIDL, or they went after the grants and local loans that were available to them. So many had received these financial assistance through PPPs. And you can see that when you're looking at the financial assistance, there's it. I can't read it. I think 53% used the PPP, 32% went after the EIDL, and then you can see that 100% were looking at getting some type of financial assistance to keep their business going on. So as they continue to adapt to this changing landscape, businesses have had to obviously adapt their operations. They had to introduce new practices, expand existing ones to accommodate consumer safety and concerns as well as expectations. So you saw this, retailers are very creative in their manner of how they adapt to a landscape. So as many of you have experienced, they've had to adapt or offer curbside delivery. They've had to go really big into e-commerce. They've had to make significant investments in this, as well as invest in the safety protocols that they needed to ensure that their customers were in a safe environment with the seating, the spacing, and things of that nature. So when you're looking at this graph, the tall green bars in the middle show that 42% indicated that they've had to reduce staff throughout the pandemic. 44% had to limit the amount of shoppers in their store. But in both cases, they all hope, the ones that are still in business, that this is all temporary. And I think we're starting to see a shift as far as opening up businesses and looking at the mask mandates, as the president mentioned yesterday, that in public, at least without large groups, you don't have to wear the mask. So with challenges comes opportunities, and many small businesses are very creative in adapting to this changing environment. This is an interesting graph because it really shows the types of operations and how these retailers or businesses had to adapt during this crisis. So you'll notice on this particular graph, and I know that it's kind of hard to read, but 36% of retailers had to reduce their staff, 51% had to change their hours of operation, 31% offered discounts to try to overcome or get consumers back in, 41% ceased to host events, 13% were big into the gift card, 18% started offering delivery services, 54% opened up curbside delivery, 38% increased or they established their online business. And that's pretty interesting because for those businesses that already were involved with e-commerce, making that leap was a little bit easier. But those that did not have an e-commerce site had to recreate that e-commerce site just to stay competitive and to survive during the business. So 38% of them had to create that. Social media sales, huge. Digital marketing as well. 28% social media, as well as having a social presence. Facebook went crazy as far as digital marketing, as well as the other social media channels. Remote working, 70%, but most of that was just on smaller businesses that, when you're looking at retail, they weren't considered essential, right? And they had to show up to operate a store. So not a lot of the staff had the opportunity to work remotely, as opposed to all businesses, which was 70%, were given that opportunity, and most of them did. And then 23% did absolutely nothing, or they didn't have to do anything to adjust. So the challenges during the holidays, and this is really looking into the fourth quarter of 2020. This is showing October to December. The pandemic challenged retailers across the board. Customer concerns about safety due to COVID was challenging for 81% of businesses, along with concerns about the economy, which was 72%. product availability as far as inventories were concerned. A lot of these retailers were very concerned about that because inventories were dried up, 71%. Lack of awareness of local stores, 69%, and reduced store capacity was 64%. So these are the challenges that a lot of these guys face during a holiday season, which is traditionally after Black Friday, right? And where they can really make up for a lot of losses they've had in the prior year. And in this case, the pandemic just exacerbated it a lot worse. Interesting, the increase in online shopping appeared further down the list at 54% after cash flow, which is 59%. So in this, you see that in the green, there's really no challenge. The orange indicates a significant challenge these guys went through, and the blue faced a slight challenge. So what the biggest concerns are? The biggest concern for these guys today is staff. Staff recruitment, 35% was the biggest. And the reason why is that with unemployment, we were talking about this prior to the presentation, with the unemployment benefits and the stimulus, that far exceeds what a lot of these guys were paying their staff. Now, typically, retailers pay above minimum wage, but as the minimum wage starts coming in, and the first round was May 1st, these guys are going to have to adjust. And we're going to go through a little bit of that in a minute. 23% of the retailers had concerns about retaining staff because, you know, when you look at big boxes like Target, Walmart, Costco, they were very proactive in increasing their minimum wage up to $15 or beyond. So retaining for a small mom and pop is going to be a pretty big challenge. Financial issues as far as cash flow, 23% was very concerned, and of course disruption to the supply chain was 20% because when the pandemic hit, it hit everything. It was global. So you're looking at China being hit, you're looking at a lot of the countries that trade with the United States, their inventories were down. Of course, it doesn't help when you have a ship stuck in the Suez Canal as well. So there's a lot of info out there on survival after COVID. And when we're looking at the future, we're looking at a consumer that's a little bit different than it was before. I think your consumers are going to be more cautious. It's all going to be about how they make use of the stimulus checks as well as the stimulus packages in general, how that's going to roll out to the economy. How much of a growth online is going to happen. And then how is the pivot from working at home with pandemic restrictions, and how is that going to impact growth in certain industries like leisure, home improvement, lumber, and reduction in things like formal wear. So if you look at this, home improvements went crazy. And the pricing, even though the inventory levels have come back, pricing has not gone down to reflect what those prices are, right? So your suppliers are still taking advantage of what was happening or occurring during the pandemic. We have a member who also owns 3 stores. Big business in formal wear. Look at what happened in formal wear last year. No proms, no weddings. Some funerals, but very few. So his formal wear was gone. And then look at the adjustment of office workers or white collar workers who are working from home. They're not wearing suits. As a matter of fact, that was my wife when I left this morning. She goes, "You're wearing a suit and a tie today." I said, "Yeah, I haven't worn one in 6 months. Hope I can still fit in it." So, you know, you're seeing a lot of changes, and a lot of these retailers are going to have to adopt. And this one particular clother that I was referring to has gone really switched more to leisure wear as opposed to formal wear of suits and of course, tuxedos and things of that nature. So e-commerce is going to continue to grow. You're going to see digital marketing continue to be out there, especially in social media channels. The second trend, I mean, it shouldn't be any surprising. The reality is, in 2020, if these guys didn't move over to an e-commerce site, they were left behind. And the same remains going forward. So they need to continue to gear up their e-commerce site, as well as to start promoting products and services. And that takes a big type of investment to create that infrastructure, and hiring the technology, the website to put it in there, to control the inventory, and how you're going to get the inventory out to your consumers. And that's going to be a big challenge. But I'm going to tell you, they're going to have to do it. Otherwise, they're not going to survive. Because now with the change, they're forced to go in here. And I don't think that the habit of buying online is ever going to go away. Even though we think that brick and mortars will come back to a certain degree. So, speaking on that note, brick and mortar retailers do have a greater need to get the consumers back in their stores. Another trend is that stores will be vital again, but it's going to be more in a fulfillment phase, meaning when they buy online, when you buy online, you can pick up your product at the store. And you're seeing that with Amazon. Amazon is building these small retail stores, which are basically glorified distribution centers, right? So from the warehouses, it will go to the distribution centers, and then the consumers will pick them up. Those consumers that return to brick and mortars, they'll be doing their research a little bit more astutely. They'll be possibly confirming stock levels at their local store, as well as availing of services such as buy online, pick up at the store, drive-through, and curbside pickup. The reality is that over the past 12 months, consumers have had to rely on purchasing online as opposed to going into a store, and to change that habit is going to be very challenging. So if you look at the second bar up here, 35% of Americans report that they prefer more contactless engagement or delivery options with retailers. And of course, the third bar chart shows that over 30% are utilizing buy online and pick up in the store more often than they ever have in the past. So again, it illustrates what I talked about earlier, is that online is here to stay, and it's not going to change, and a lot of these retailers are just going to have to adjust to it. So let's talk about the staffing challenges, the minimum wage. The minimum wage increase in the state of Virginia was passed by the General Assembly during the 2020 session, and the first phase has taken effect May 1st. This legislation was originally supposed to take effect on January 1st of 2021, but due to the pandemic, the General Assembly fortunately delayed it. So what's going to happen is that the hourly wage went up to $9.50, it was $7 an hour. It will go up again January 1st of 2022 to $11, and then it's going to increase to $12 an hour in January 1 of 2023, and then it will be at $15 on January 1 of 2024. So, as I mentioned earlier, your big boxes such as Target, Amazon, Walmart, they have proactively increased their wages. So your small mom and pops, it's a big squeeze on them, and they're trying to find ways to overcome it. So really the ways they're looking at overcoming it is they're either going to have to increase the cost of goods. They're going to have to look at areas that they can decrease across the cost of operations, automation. They're going to have to reduce products and services. They're going to have they have an option of reducing staff or staffing hours, which are all options that are are going to negatively impact these guys, but it's something that they're going to have to overcome. So with that, John, I'm open for questions and answers.
Any questions? I've got a couple. Do you see the alcohol sales, the to-go alcohol sales from restaurants sticking around? I imagine that's been pretty helpful for the local restaurants.
I don't know, but it increased dramatically. And it was a way to get the consumers into the restaurants. Right. So, no, I don't have that data. Sorry.
That's all right.
Why would it come from you that you would
I don't
be
know.
talking about alcohol sales?
Do you think that the force of the local small businesses to get onto the e-commerce train has helped them be more competitive with
Absolutely.
the national chains?
Absolutely. And, you know, we have been trying to promote, especially from an education standpoint, hey, you've got to get on e-commerce because it's moving that way anyway, right? And the pandemic just kind of sped things up. And we've all learned. And I'm a big believer in when there's a challenge, there's always an opportunity. So if I look at our foundation, I look at our school, for instance, we have a lot more attendance because we're offering that remote. I look at how we're going to host our board meetings. Going to be hybrid, just like the Virginia Club is doing today. So I think that when you looked at a pandemic, these guys, if they're going to survive, they're going to have to adjust. E-commerce was something they had to do. Now, it takes an investment in it. Some of them had to hire people just to oversee the e-commerce sites, as well as manage the inventory. You know, a trend up until last year was it's more about showroom space as opposed to backroom inventory space. So you have these fulfillment strategies that, okay, I want less inventory in the back. I want more showroom because that's where the sales are. And then I got to put in the logistics to make sure that I can still get the inventory in when the product is being purchased. Well, that really has a lot of ramifications for e-commerce because they have to, not only do they have to get the inventory, they have to ship it out. Who's going to absorb that cost, right? Especially when they're competing. And how soon can they get the product to the consumer? But the consumer is, you know, shopping is more, consumers traditionally, because they're humans, like that community engagement. They like to be able to feel, I mean, I can't imagine buying furniture online. Can't really imagine buying clothes online. There are certain things that you want to be able to go and see and touch. You know, but at the same time, because of the shift, these retailers are going to have to do that. It's not going away. And how much of a percentage in the future, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
What else? Anything else? Yes, sir.
So, with all this money going in, and with the costs going up, where do you see, how's the inflation factor going to be here with retail?
But we had that conversation early, and I was telling Earl that it's gonna have to impact inflation. Now, a lot of the economists are saying it would be temporary, but I don't think so. I mean, look at the housing market. The housing market has gone up crazy because lack of inventory. But when we're looking at building supplies, like a sheet of plywood that was $20 a sheet, now it's $60, $80 a sheet, even though the supply is still there, that's inflationary. I mean, there for a while, we could say, okay, COVID, pandemic, manufacturing had to shut down. Right? Plants had to shut down. So it impacted inventory. That hasn't been the case in the last 6 to 7 months. Those plants are still back open. They're still, you know, producing lumber, but the prices haven't gone down. Why is that? I think it's an inflationary number.
He basically touched on the question that I was finding this guy. But one thing about logistics, you know, as you mentioned, people moving to e-commerce, it's easy from the buyer's standpoint just to click in and fulfilling that. But then there's the logistics of getting to point A to point B. And, you read in the news that, stuff, the backlog, anybody has to mail anything or ship anything, everything's being delayed. I even read an article, expect gasoline shortages this summer because everybody's driving, but they can't get the gasoline distributed. So, so as retailers migrate into this e-commerce, are they letting third parties handle all the logistic problems, or how are they being part of it? Because somebody delivers their own stuff and it's all being sent by UPS or FedEx or whatever.
Right.
There seems to be a challenge as you move into e-commerce, the logistics of it.
It is, and that's a good question. From my experience and from what we are seeing, the small mom and pops don't have the financial capability to contract a third-party delivery person, right? They may rely on their own staff if it's a local thing, but typically they're relying on traditional UPS, mail, FedEx, companies like that. But yet they're paying most likely a different rate because their volumes are going to be less. And the other thing too is that you look at the industries that were targeted during the pandemic. It doesn't look like it, but I bought a spin bike because I decided not to go into the gym anymore. I mean, they're incubators, or they were. I don't think so much now, but it took 3 months for that NordiTrack spin bike to get to our house, where in normal times it's done in a week. So inventory impacted a lot of different, but that's based on market demand, not as much on manufacturing. And when you look at furniture, well, the reason why furniture is going crazy is because home sales are going crazy. Now, when you look at home sales, well, obviously the people that are getting hurt are the first-time home buyers. The people who are benefiting are those that are probably going to retirement or senior living or getting out of their houses permanently and not having to rely on resale. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You hear anything from restaurant owners about what aspects will go back to the way they were before as opposed to things that will change forever?
It's all about capacity. I mean, I really think that they got the short end of the stick. And I was having this conversation with both John and Earl earlier. Stimulus checks, I mean, the last package, only 9% of it really went to those businesses or those consumers who have been impacted. I did not lay off one person in my office, but yet they still got stimulus checks. Nobody in my family lost their jobs or their paychecks, but they still got stimulus checks. And now, what is the purpose of that? Is to stimulate the economy? If so, I didn't qualify. Maybe I should have gotten one, right? Or is it to serve those people who are hurting the most, those that have been unemployed? But to your point, to those restaurants, because when those restaurants had to deal with 25% capacity, and then they had limited time of operations, and then they had to invest for outside dining, which really, what's the difference between outside tents and inside? I don't know. That's a whole different argument or discussion that could be had. But they had to put a lot of money in there, and what these guys are trying to do, they're just trying to survive and keep their employees employed. Make sure, because a lot of these restaurant owners, they haven't made a dime in the last year. And that's brings up another interesting point. What we saw was those businesses that did not have strong balance sheets, Mark, with cash reserves were the ones least likely that they weren't going to make it. Because they have to, everybody thought this time last year, 3 months, 4 months of cash reserves, we'll get through this. And typically when I talk about cash reserves, I'm talking about 3 or 4 months of operation expenses, correct? To get me through this, which are never going to get back. PPP did help, but it didn't solve all of it. But now it ended up having to be, especially in the food and beverage industry, it had to be a year. Because they're just now ready to reopen. I think it was, last week? Are you allowing them to reopen till 12 o'clock or their regular closing hours? And opening bar seating as long as they're still spread out? Does that answer your question?
It does.
I mean, those restaurant guys, they've got hammered. And they're the ones who really needed the help. And it would have been nice that they would have gotten the help to subsidize their hourly wages, because that also is going to bring up another challenge. Because you've got, especially in food and beverage industry, you might have a server that's making $3 or $4, but then you got tips. But by law, they're going to have a minimum wage of $9. So how they got to look at that ratio and figure that out and make sure that. And then when you look at these guys, so let's say I think on average a small mom and pop pays $10 an hour. Minimum wage is going to go to $9, but they're going to have to adapt. They don't want to pay their employee minimum wage, so they're going to have to increase it to $12 an hour. And how are they going to overcome that? The restaurants, the restaurants were the ones that got hit the biggest, as well as hospitality and cruise lines. Any other questions?
One last one. You think COVID was or the final nail in the coffin of the mall across the street?
That's a dangerous question. Yeah, I think I would defer that one. All right, defer that. That all malls are faced with challenges throughout the whole country, not just that one. And they're all having to retool themselves to survive during a changing environment, and I don't think that's necessarily COVID. I think that's just shopping habits.
All right. Well, Ray, thanks for coming out today.
Okay, so I hope I didn't bore you with all these charts and things of that nature.
Oh, very interesting.
Okay, thank you guys.
All right. Well, thanks for everybody for coming out today. Wills Miller is going to try to get out our pool tournament announcements to start in May. He's also looking into trying to get some politicians from the General Assembly to come in and give us a legislative update, since we just had some big announcements for veto session a few weeks ago. And if we can't get those lined up, we might do our May speakers luncheon as maybe a happy hour. But we'll keep you posted on that. Thanks for everybody for tuning in online, and hope you all have a great rest of the week.